They called him the real Godfather of New York, but the strange part is that Carlo Gambino didn't look like power. No flashy speeches, no headlines he asked for. Just a quiet man in Massapequa, Long Island, older now, heart failing, neighbors thinking he was nobody special, while an entire city still moved on decisions he'd made decades earlier. Tonight, you're not just getting his rise, you're getting the slow, tragic shape of his downfall, the tiny mistakes that pulled a spotlight he never wanted, the choice of successor that poisoned the future, and the one act of revenge that accidentally lit the fuse for the next era. And it all starts far from New York, before anyone knew his name.
Palermo doesn't announce itself like New York. It seeps into you. Warm air that feels heavy, streets that feel too narrow, and a kind of respect that isn't a virtue so much as a survival instinct. In late summer of 1902, Carlo Gambino is born into that heat, into a place where power isn't something you earn on paper. It's a shadow that follows certain men and a silence that arrives before they do. And that matters, because the first thing Gambino learns isn't how to fight, it's how to watch. He grows up where information is currency, where a boy can learn more standing at the edge of a conversation than trying to dominate the center. The American gangster myth is loud: suits, guns, temper, headlines. Gambino's beginning is the opposite: patience, restraint, the discipline of not showing your hand. As a teenager, he isn't building a legend, he's building a nervous system tuned to danger. Ordinary moments teach him the real rules: men lingering outside a shop too long, conversations dying when a new voice enters, neighbors who move without explanation. Palermo teaches a simple equation: the people who last aren't always the strongest, they're the ones who understand the room before the room understands them. That instinct becomes his weapon in America, because the early 20th century United States is a machine hungry for bodies, labor, immigrants, people willing to vanish into neighborhoods and become invisible. And for Gambino, invisibility isn't weakness, it's camouflage. In 1921, around 19, he reaches the United States as a stowaway. That single detail sets his tone for life. He doesn't arrive through the front door, he arrives through the cracks, already knowing the system isn't something you ask permission from, it's something you move around. New York is exploding, languages stacked in tenements, neighborhoods turning into mini-nations, opportunity making the city ruthless. And crime isn't separate from society, it feeds off the same arteries: unions, docks, local politics, cash economies. Gambino fits this world perfectly because he never needs to be the loudest man at the table. He needs to know where the table is and who controls the invitation list. The underworld is learning to operate like a corporation: layers, buffers, deniability, continuity. Violence exists, but it's expensive. It brings attention, and attention is the one thing Gambino never confuses with power. He's described the same way again and again: quiet, controlled, calculating, rarely emotional in public. That doesn't mean he lacks emotion, it means he refuses to spend it where it can be used against him. In a world where one wrong sentence can become a reason to remove you, discipline isn't personality, it's armor. And here's the seed of his downfall. Most people think power is something you display. Gambino learns the strongest position is often the least dramatic one, the boss who doesn't look like a boss. But you can't build something that large without leaving footprints, and you can't control a city for decades without eventually being forced into a spotlight you never trained for. Because New York doesn't just reward ambition, it punishes mistakes.
And as Gambino settles into its underworld, the question isn't whether he can survive the streets anymore. It's which war will remake the entire underworld and what kind of man he'll become when it's over. Over the next decade, Gambino keeps his head down and learns what New York really runs on: money flows, favors, and silence. And by the time the 1930s arrive, the underworld he's been studying doesn't just compete, it goes to war. By the 1930s, New York's underworld isn't just hungry crews fighting over corners. It's starting to behave like a living organism, learning, adapting, punishing weakness. And it learns the brutal way, through war. On the surface, the city keeps moving through the Depression. Underneath, Old World pride collides with New World ambition in a conflict history remembers as the Castellammarese War. It runs through 1930 and 1931, and it isn't cinematic. It's paranoia, ambushes, shifting loyalties, men waking up unsure whether the person pouring their coffee is loyal or simply patient. People reduce it to Joe the Boss Masseria versus Salvatore Maranzano, and in the simplest sense, that's true. But what matters is the lesson. Chaos is expensive, and attention is fatal. In an unstable environment, the man who doesn't panic becomes gravity, and this is where Carlo Gambino's quiet stops being a personality and starts becoming valuable. Gambino isn't the headline architect. He's a rising figure inside a system learning a hard truth. It's not enough to win fights. You need a structure that prevents fights from happening in the first place. When Masseria is killed in April 1931 and Maranzano is killed later that year in September, the message becomes obvious. The old boss of bosses model is unstable. Too much ego, too much visibility, too many men reaching for absolute control. So a new generation pushes a different architecture, the Commission. Less a peace treaty than a business decision. War burns money, and war brings heat. New York is too profitable to keep tearing apart from the inside, so they reorganize. Rules, roles, boundaries. And once those rules exist, the kind of power Gambino prefers finally has room to grow. Structured systems reward stable, disciplined, procedural men, not men addicted to drama. Gambino feels built for meeting rooms more than street corners, patient enough to sit through hours of talk without needing the spotlight, strategic enough to wait years for the right opening instead of lunging and leaving fingerprints. That's how you become dangerous in an organization that claims it wants order. You become the person the order depends on. But here's the psychological pivot that matters for the eventual downfall. The Commission model convinces its best operators that the system can control the future. Plan well enough, keep violence contained enough, stay quiet enough, and you can outsmart the outside world forever. The problem is, the outside world doesn't stay still. America changes, law enforcement changes, technology changes, politics changes. And inside the Mafia, human nature never changes. Men still want more. Men still get insulted. Men still make reckless decisions when pride gets touched. So Gambino leans into a philosophy that looks almost calm. Domination through normalcy. Rackets that feel routine. Money that feels like gravity. Power that looks like infrastructure. Labor, access. Quiet agreements that decide which businesses survive and which suffer. It doesn't excite newspapers, but it makes cities bend. In the consolidation that follows, Gambino's reputation grows internally like a deep current, slow, steady, hard to see, impossible to ignore. He becomes linked to the Mangano organization, positioning him inside the family that will one day carry his name. At this stage, he isn't a legend, he's the reliable figure. Low heat, smooth operations, decisions that don't create messes. And trust is the rarest commodity in a world built on betrayal. That's why his rise is tragic in slow motion. The more stability he creates, the more he becomes the foundation, and every crack eventually becomes his problem. Because order is still made of people. One reckless personality can drag everyone back into chaos. And as the years move forward, a particular volatility starts gathering in Gambino's orbit, an energy built not on quiet leverage, but on fear itself. The kind that makes even allies flinch. The system will avoid solving that problem as long as it can, until one day it can't. And when it finally breaks, it won't feel like a war, it will feel like a single moment. Quick, public, unforgettable, inside a place that was supposed to be safe.
If Carlo Gambino's world was built on quiet leverage, Albert Anastasia was built on the opposite. He didn't just represent violence, he represented the kind that created gravity, the kind that made people adjust their posture when his name entered the room. By the early 1950s, the underworld is technically organized, but it still runs on human nature, and Anastasia's nature is raw. In a city where bosses want to look like businessmen, he's the reminder that every system still has teeth. That creates a problem for someone like Gambino, not because Gambino is weak, because he's precise. He wants stability, money that repeats, power that doesn't require putting out fires every week. Anastasia is a fire that walks into rooms on purpose. Gambino can sense what this style guarantees: heat, revenge cycles, emotions, fear, humiliation, rage, that don't stay contained. They leak into streets, newspapers, and the attention of people who love budgets, careers, and press conferences. And once outside attention is invited, it doesn't politely leave. So this becomes the tension defining Gambino's rise. He's climbing inside a family ruled by a man who doesn't value what he values. And in that world, you don't transfer departments. You survive, adapt, or die. Gambino adapts by becoming the counterweight, the man who calms the room after Anastasia sharpens the air. If Anastasia is the gun on the table, Gambino is the closed door after the shouting stops. And the key difference is optics. Gambino understands outsiders don't need the full truth to destroy you. They just need enough narrative to justify pressure. His philosophy is simple. You cannot run an empire for decades inside a permanent emergency. Anastasia's reign feels like a permanent emergency. There's another layer that makes the slow tragedy feel inevitable. A volatile boss doesn't only scare enemies, he scares allies. Fear produces obedience, but it also produces private resentment. Resentment collects. It turns small slights into permanent memory. And loyalty in this world isn't warmth, it's calculation. Who keeps you alive? Who keeps you paid? Who keeps you safer from the government? If a boss starts failing at that, the math shifts. Gambino watches that shift without panic, like a man hearing floorboards creak long before they snap. By the mid-1950s, Gambino isn't just around, he's positioned, trusted, close enough to power to feel every tremor. The post-war era is profitable, union strong, construction expanding, waterfront busy, airports growing. There's real money in being quiet and embedded. The family doesn't need drama, it needs integration. But Anastasia's style doesn't blend, it intimidates. And intimidation works until the cost becomes higher than the benefit. So a silent process begins. Not one moment you can point to, but dozens. Conversations pausing when certain men walk in, seats chosen differently, words measured, alliances shifting so subtly only insiders feel it. And hanging over everything is the commission model, the underworld's boardroom. If a boss becomes too unstable, removal can be framed as stability, not rebellion. A business decision. That's the dark elegance of the system. It can kill a king and call it governance. Anastasia believes fear makes him untouchable.
Gambino understands fear can also make you disposable, because too many people start imagining a world without you. And then the story narrows toward a single location that feels absurdly ordinary: a barbershop, a mirror, a chair, aftershave in the air, a radio humming, scissors clicking. The irony is perfect: the most feared man stepping into a room built for routine and calm. And that's why it's the perfect stage for the kind of power Gambino understands best: power that doesn't announce itself until it's already done. Because once the decision is made, it won't come with drama, it will come with precision. And the next time you hear Albert Anastasia's name, it won't be attached to a reign, it will be attached to a moment. Brief, brutal, unforgettable, where the quiet man's patience finally meets the loud man's blind spot.
The strange thing about a well-run criminal system is that its most important decisions rarely feel dramatic in the moment. They feel ordinary, like paperwork, like routine, like a quiet morning where the city is already moving and nobody notices the one room where history is about to change. On October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia walks into the barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. It's designed to make men look respectable: clean collar, fresh shave, a mirror that tells you you're still in control. Anastasia sits down as if the world belongs to him, because that's how he's lived, through dominance, fear, the assumption that nobody would dare. For a few normal seconds, nothing happens. The room hums, metal clinking softly, footsteps sliding past each other, the kind of quiet that makes you forget a city can be violent. Then two men walk in with faces partially covered, and the temperature changes instantly. The details get argued: scarves, speed, confusion, because bold violence turns mechanics into myth. But the core fact stays cold. Anastasia is shot and killed while sitting in that chair. The man who embodied raw intimidation is removed in a place built for grooming and normalcy. And that's what makes it psychologically unsettling. The message doesn't require an explanation of hierarchy or the commission. It's visual. If someone like Anastasia can be touched in a public, ordinary setting, then nobody is untouchable. Not the loud ones, not the feared ones. A king can fall without a war. A reign can end in silence and scissors. And if you're listening at night, it's easy to treat that hit like the climax. But in Carlo Gambino's story, it's the opening of a new kind of power. Because the murder doesn't just remove a man, it removes a style. It removes the emotional chaos Gambino spent his life trying to avoid. Inside the organization, you can almost feel the air change. Less panic, fewer fires, more planning. The shift isn't morality, it's efficiency. And efficiency is what makes an underworld truly dangerous, because it blends into routine and hides inside the city's habits. This is where Gambino steps forward, not like a politician taking a stage, but like a man quietly taking the keys. By late 1957, he's positioned to control what had been the Anastasia Mangano organization, and over time, the family becomes known publicly by his name, the Gambino family. Names here aren't labels, they're brands, warnings, history compressed into one word. And the irony is that Gambino never looks like a brand. He doesn't crave fame. He wants the symbol to be the system itself, stable enough that it doesn't need him to perform. His power is administrative, deciding what flows and what stops: money, influence, labor, access. But the underworld has a built-in problem. Leadership changes create movement. Allies need reassurance, rivals test boundaries. The commission wants confirmation the new order is real. Stabilizing after a public assassination means meetings, quiet coordination, the kind of contact that leaves ripples.
Rumors move faster than facts. Who approved it? Who benefited? Who's rising? Who's being sidelined? And the louder the event, the stronger the curiosity. Curiosity becomes pressure, and pressure creates mistakes. So Gambino tightens and organizes, leaning into calmer rackets and predictable streams. In the short term, it works. The family looks quieter, and that quiet becomes a new language of fear. But the next trap is already forming. Because of his reign depends on invisibility, the most dangerous thing isn't a rival with a gun. It's a moment where the invisible becomes visible. And just weeks after the barber chair, the underworld does something that feels ordinary to them, something they've done before. They gather, not in Manhattan, not in Brooklyn, upstate, away from the noise, where unfamiliar cars line up like a flare in the dark. Gambino has inherited a throne built for shadows, but now the shadows are shifting.
The meeting wasn't supposed to be history. It was supposed to be maintenance, tightening bolts on a machine that had just survived a violent jolt. Weeks after Albert Anastasia is killed in that Manhattan barbershop, the underworld needs new balances confirmed, new understandings locked in, and new egos kept from exploding in public. That's the kind of problem Carlo Gambino hates most. Not the violence itself, but the ripple it creates, the sudden need for coordination. Too many people in one place at one time for reasons that can't be written down. So the logic feels comforting. Leave the city, find somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. Apalachin, New York. Rural, slow, the kind of place where a passing truck is usually the loudest sound. On November 14, 1957, that calm countryside becomes the setting for a mistake so clean it feels unreal in hindsight. Too many expensive cars, too many unfamiliar faces, too much certainty that secrecy is permanent rather than fragile. The gathering happens at the home of Joseph "Joe the Barber" Barbara, and the agenda, by most accounts, tracks exactly what you'd expect after a throne shift. Gambling, major rackets, the redistribution of operations tied to Anastasia's death, and the broader reshuffling in New York, with Vito Genovese pushing for something that looks suspiciously like a national summit. That's the quiet irony. These men live by the idea that power is taken, not granted, yet even they crave recognition, witnesses, a room full of people silently agreeing, yes, the new order is real. Gambino, who built his life around avoiding public narrative, is now in a moment where the underworld itself needs to see him clearly, even if the public never does. And the trap isn't genius or high-tech, it's small-town suspicion, the kind of curiosity that becomes lethal when it collides with arrogance. New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell notices odd signals around Barbara's property, out-of-state plates, unusual activity, a rhythm that doesn't match a normal rural day. Once police start writing plates down and running them, the story basically writes itself. These aren't random visitors. These are names tied to known criminals, men who are never supposed to be gathered in one place where you can photograph the shape of the network. What happens next is almost cinematic because it's so human. The moment law enforcement becomes undeniable, the meeting turns into instinct. Men don't debate policy, they flee. Across lawns, through woods, down roads, dressed like they're late for a wedding, moving like they've just heard a gunshot behind their own name. Police barricade roads and detain 58 men as others escape on foot. Estimates of total attendance often hover closer to 100, and that number matters. Dozens feels local, nearly 100 feels national. Either way, America sees something it can't unsee. organized crime not as scattered street thugs, but as a coordinated leadership class meeting like executives. Apalachin becomes a hinge because it delivers a visual, well-dressed men with criminal reputations, all in one place, all offering shifting excuses: a barbecue, a sick friend, a social visit. The truth is too big to say out loud, but the damage is done. The public doesn't need a confession to understand what it witnessed: coordination, governance, a board meeting for crime. For Gambino, this is the nightmare his career was designed to prevent. It doesn't destroy his power, but it changes the environment. What law enforcement feels confident saying, how politicians talk, how much pressure agencies can justify, and it primes the country to believe what will be said plainly later when Joseph Valachi testifies in 1963 and describes Cosa Nostra's existence and structure for a national audience. So Gambino does what he always does. He adapts. If meetings are now dangerous, you minimize them. If gatherings expose structure, you push power into places where it doesn't look like power. Labor, shipping, construction, unions, contracts, the invisible choke points where a city breathes without realizing someone has a hand on the valve. Apalachin teaches him a refined lesson. The age of big rooms is over. The future belongs to control that can survive even when everyone is watching.
After Apalachin, the smartest men didn't stop doing business, they stopped doing business in ways that could be photographed. Carlo Gambino understood the new danger wasn't a rival family with better shooters, it was visibility. Once the public learns how to recognize a pattern, the pattern stops being safe. So his power shifts into something that doesn't look like power at all. If you wanted to find his kingdom, you didn't look for nightclubs. You looked for permission points, docks, trucking routes, construction sites, union halls, shipping schedules, contracts that decide who works and who starves. New York isn't held together by speeches. It's held together by delivery times, payrolls, and labor. And anyone who can interrupt those, even briefly, can extract money without ever firing a shot. Start at the waterfront. The docks aren't romantic, they're arteries. Slow them down and everyone feels it. Merchants, restaurants, factories. That's why the leverage is so simple. If your union can make labor difficult, businesses pay to make it easy. If shipments can be delayed, damaged, or misplaced, then protection starts looking like a monthly utility bill. Gambino's crime is less like a robbery and more like rent, the quiet payment you make because disruption in a city becomes catastrophe. Now add trucking and construction, two systems built on scheduling and fragility. Trucks move food, clothes, building materials, routes and access are everything. Construction is constant, expensive, and already delay-prone. So when labor issues appear, permits stall, supplies arrive wrong, or crews suddenly vanish, many businesses choose the least painful option: pay for stability. Gambino's genius wasn't inventing these rackets, it was leaning into them as camouflage. After Apalachin, unions and contracts aren't just revenue, they're invisibility. There's a deeper psychology under it. Gambino keeps violence rare not because he's gentle, but because violence creates emotions, and emotions create mistakes. A man grieving or humiliated talks too much, moves too fast, leaves trails. But a businessman paying a fee to keep a project moving doesn't feel like he's in a war. He feels like he's dealing with the weather, unpleasant, unavoidable, not worth fighting. That's what makes this kind of control hard to remove. You can arrest a gunman, you can flip a loudmouth, but how do you arrest a system that hides inside labor disputes and business arrangements? At its peak, Gambino's reign is almost invisible. Stability inside the family means profit. Profit means fewer internal wars. Fewer bodies means less heat. And heat is the currency he values more than money.
But every strength has a shadow. The more embedded his power becomes, the more the government learns where to look. Apalachin doesn't just expose a meeting, it upgrades law enforcement ambition. Over time, attention leans into waterfront influence, union corruption, labor racketeering, exactly where Gambino lives. And that pressure produces one modern danger he can't intimidate: long prison sentences. A short bid is a bruise, a long bid is a life shift. When men start hearing the word life, they start looking for exits, deals, explanations, a story where betrayal becomes survival. That's why narcotics matter to Gambino as risk management. Drugs bring extreme sentences create informants, and informants turn silence into evidence, routine into a case file. So the cliff edge is quiet but fatal. Gambino has built an empire that doesn't need gunfire to enforce itself. But the more corporate it becomes, the more vulnerable it is to the one weapon that doesn't care about fear: information. And in the next section, that weapon starts to matter more than ever, because the biggest threat to his reign isn't a rival boss. It's the moment a loyal soldier decides he'd rather be a witness. Carlo Gambino didn't fear chaos the way people imagine. He didn't fear a street corner gunfight. Those are loud, rare, almost predictable. What he feared was quieter, the slow conversion of loyalty into testimony. Not a rival kicking your door in, but a man you've known for years sitting under fluorescent lights while a prosecutor explains what 25 years feels like when you count every Christmas you'll miss. Gambino's empire ran on silence, and silence isn't just tradition, it's a psychological state. A man believing the system will protect him. Once that belief cracks, everything cracks with it. That's why drugs mattered to him. Not as morality, but as risk. Narcotics weren't just huge money, they were a direct pipeline to the worst kind of pressure: intense attention and long sentences. A short bid can be worn like a badge. A long bid turns honor into a luxury. It makes identity negotiable. So the rule, often described as strict hostility toward narcotics inside his orbit, worked like a firewall. Not perfect, not always obeyed, but essential. Keep the business in crimes that stay muddy, not crimes that let the government build careers around destroying you. And the environment was changing. After Apalachin, the public found it easier to believe the Mafia wasn't folklore, it was structure. Once the public believes, politicians get permission to push harder. Investigators start treating organized crime like a system. Executives, meetings, revenue streams. Pressure doesn't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it arrives like sediment. Files thickening, names repeated, patterns noticed. Then 1963 hits like an earthquake. Joseph Valachi testifies publicly and describes Cosa Nostra to a national audience. The details matter less than the effect. Secrecy had been a shield. Now the shield has visible cracks. Once the Mafia becomes legible, something juries can understand, it becomes easier to target, easier to explain, easier to prosecute. For Gambino, the war turns modern. Not bullets, but attention and information. Agencies learn to turn routine into conspiracy, influence into evidence, ordinary life into a courtroom narrative. And here's the uncomfortable truth. You can run a tight ship, but you can't control human hunger. Drugs were everywhere in the 60s into the 70s, and some men touched them anyway, not just for cash, but for status, speed, shortcuts. Shortcuts skip discipline, and undisciplined men create heat. They spend loud, argue loud, retaliate loud, get arrested loud. Then they enter the room Gambino feared most, the one with no windows, where silence becomes optional. That's where informants are born. Not always cowards, often men at the edge of fear, men protecting family, men who feel disrespected. Once a man becomes a witness, fear changes direction. He stops fearing the street and starts fearing the sentence. Gambino tried to engineer a world where that decision would be rare. Avoid extreme sentence crimes, keep violence controlled, keep meetings small, keep the structure stable. Corporate risk management, accept the losses of prison cells and funerals. For a while it works, but time introduces new methods, new incentives, new ways to extract information. By the late 1960s, the state is learning how to prosecute systems, not just individuals. And that's the personal tragedy. Gambino built invisibility as armor, yet the era is shifting toward enforcement that doesn't require you to be flashy to be vulnerable. Eventually, the government doesn't need you to do something loud. It only needs to touch you once. And when that touch comes, it won't be gunfire, it will be paper.
By 1970, Carlo Gambino's power felt permanent, like a building that had stood so long nobody remembered the ground beneath it. But permanence in his world was always an illusion, and it doesn't break with bullets. It breaks with paper, files, indictments that don't care how quiet you are. He'd spent a lifetime treating heat like poison, treating public drama like a trap only impatient men fall into. Still, pressure had been building for years. After Apalachin, after the public started believing organized crime wasn't rumor but structure. Eventually, the state doesn't need you to be reckless. It only needs to touch you once. In 1970, that touch arrives. Gambino is indicted on hijacking and theft-related rackets, unsexy infrastructure crime, the kind that lives behind ordinary city life and prints money without glamour. Then comes the second blade, colder and personal, immigration. The stowaway detail from 1921, the crack he entered America through, returns as a legal weakness. He's ordered deported. It's perfect irony. The man who built an empire on not being seen is pulled into a bureaucratic spotlight that doesn't respond to fear or reputation. You can't threaten the statute. You can only stall, adapt, and hope time stays on your side. But time isn't neutral anymore. It's inside his chest. Accounts describe serious heart problems, and his health becomes a grim kind of shield, because deportation isn't just a ruling, it's an operation. He isn't built for dramatic escapes or street chaos. His strength has always been calm thinking and a system that runs without him standing in the room. So his downfall doesn't look like an action ending. It looks like a slow tightening. The master of risk management now facing the one risk he can't fully control, physical decline. And yet, he doesn't collapse. He does what he's always done: reduce motion, minimize exposure, tighten the structure. He buries power deeper into contracts, favors, routine leverage. Massapequa, so ordinary it feels like camouflage, becomes the symbol, not hiding like a fugitive, but living his version of control. From the outside, an aging man in suburbia. From the inside, still gravity. But pressure changes the men around you. When the government reaches higher, everyone below feels squeezed, and squeezes produce what Gambino hates most: impatience, greed, emotional shortcuts, bigger risks, louder arguments, decisions made without permission. Gambino wants business logic, profit, stability, deniability. Humans drag it back into pride, insults, revenge. And that's the shift of the early 1970s. Legal danger can be buffered with lawyers and delays. A personal wound can't. It changes the chemistry in the room, what feels necessary. Gambino built his reign on avoiding that eruption. Then the universe tests him anyway. 1972, his nephew Emmanuel Gambino is abducted and killed. In his world, protection is the promise. When someone reaches into your bloodline, it feels like an attack on the promise itself. Now the next loop tightens shut. The man who minimized violence is being pushed toward violence, not because it's good business, but because it's personal.
and the response won't just heat the family, it will elevate younger men who thrive on street mythology, the opposite of Gambino's instinct for silence. The tragedy isn't that he's aging, it's that the era is changing, and the spark is as old as Sicily, a blood debt demanding payment.
Manny Gambino's abduction and death didn't just hurt Carlo Gambino, it poisoned his method. For decades, he ruled through controlled calm, violence rare, drama minimal, money steady, heat low. Then, in the early 1970s, that calm tears. Many accounts place it in 1972 and link it to Irish kidnap and ransom operator James from Queens McBratney. Other versions argue it was a robbery murder later framed as a kidnapping during a ransom panic. Inside Gambino's world, perception becomes reality. If an outside crew could reach into the bloodline, the hierarchy had to respond, not for romance, because unpunished humiliation invites repetition. That response required street men, fast, hungry, decisive. One of them was John Gotti, early 1970s, not a legend yet, but already rising, charismatic, and hard to keep invisible. As Manny's death hardened into a target, the solution wasn't courtrooms, it was removal. The most repeated account, a team including Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, and Ralph Gallione located McBratney on Staten Island and approached him posing as detectives, trying to make it look clean like an arrest. It went chaotic. McBratney resisted. Gallione shot and killed him on May 22, 1973. Publicly, it looked like an underworld feud. Privately, it was a message: you don't touch the Gambinos and live comfortably afterward. But revenge doesn't just punish, it promotes. Gotti's willingness becomes internal currency. He's identified, arrested in 1974, and ends up with a deal leading to a conviction, often described as attempted manslaughter, and roughly 4 years. The stability move creates the opposite, a rising star. And with Gambino's health tightening, that star feeds the unavoidable question: succession.
Empires don't truly crack when a boss is indicted. They crack when replacement becomes thinkable, because a replacement turns the throne into a contest. By the mid-1970s, Gambino could feel that contest forming: quiet shifts, private loyalties, men preparing for a future without him. Succession wasn't just a job, it was philosophy. 2 futures had names: Neil Dellacroce, the street backbone, respected by crews, tied to enforcement and the Manhattan faction, and Paul Castellano, the business-forward choice: higher-level money, cleaner-looking structures, less street noise. Gambino bypassed Dellacroce and chose Castellano, a decision that made strategic sense in Gambino terms: less heat, more insulation, but landed like humiliation in the bloodstream. Even if Dellacroce remained underboss, the family effectively split into 2 temperatures: street loyalty versus corporate control. That split didn't explode immediately, but it stored pressure. And in the crack between those factions, men like Gotti, built for reputation and street mythology, had room to grow. The machine still ran, it just wasn't whole anymore. It would stay calm only as long as Gambino stayed alive.
On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino dies at home in Massapequa. No ambush, no sirens. Heart disease, the one enemy he could never negotiate with. He dies with legal pressure still hanging over him, but his ending matches his reign: quiet, suburban, almost ordinary. The tragedy isn't his death. The tragedy is what his death releases. With Gambino gone, the balance he held by sheer presence becomes harder to maintain. Castellano embodies the business future. Dellacroce becomes the human bridge to the street faction. The family continues, but now it runs with 2 competing visions under one name. And the long fuse becomes visible years later.
Dellacroce dies on December 2nd, 1985. 2 weeks after that, Paul Castellano is murdered on December 16, 1985, outside Sparks Steakhouse, a brazen public hit widely attributed to John Gotti and his circle. The symbolism is brutal. Gambino built power through invisibility, and the era that follows becomes famous for being seen. Gambino didn't fall in gunfire. He fell through time, through cracks he delayed for decades, until his silence finally stopped governing the room. And he wasn't the only one. If you want more horrific, enigmatic gangster downfalls, we've put a full playlist of our videos right here. And trust me, the next case is even more unexpected.